Some men mistake obedience for love. They believe that if a woman never raises her voice, she must never have had a reason to. This is the story of a young woman who finally said the one word her guardian could not forgive. The mark it left on her cheek, and the 4 words a duke spoke that made an entire ballroom go silent. If you have ever been told that saying no would cost you everything, listen to what it cost him instead. Cassandra Fenwick had kept her uncle's household ledgers since she was 16 years old. Ever since her Aunt Judith's fever took her in the space of a single terrible week and left no one else in the house who could add a column of figures without losing count halfway through. It had started as a kindness, or so her uncle had called it at the time, a way for a grieving girl to keep her hands and her mind occupied. 6 years later, Cassandra understood it rather differently. It had never been a kindness. It had been the moment Lord Reginald Fenwick discovered that his niece was more useful to him counting his money than spending any of it on herself. She was 22 now, quiet in the particular, deliberate way of someone who had learned that silence was safer than opinion. And she knew the contents of her uncle's accounts better than she knew the sound of her own laugh, which she had not heard in some years. She remembered her mother only in fragments by now, the smell of lavender water, a low humming voice reading aloud on winter evenings, the particular way she had once tucked a stray curl behind Cassandra's ear and told her that a clever mind was worth considerably more than a fortune, because no man could ever legislate it away from her. Cassandra had been 11 when the fever took her mother, and 16 when her Aunt Judith followed, and in the years since she had come to understand that her mother's confident assurance had been, in the end, only partly true. A clever mind could not be legislated away. Perhaps, but it could certainly be put to work entirely for someone else's benefit. For 6 years, without a single word of thanks. The Colville settlement is generous, her uncle said, not looking up from his breakfast. He said it the way he said most things concerning her as a fact already decided, requiring no more discussion than the weather. 4,000 a year, and he does not care that you bring nothing to the match. You should be on your knees thanking me. Baron Colville is 51. Uncle, Baron Colville is solvent, which is considerably more than can be said for most men who would have you at all. Reginald finally looked up, his pale eyes flat and unbothered. You will be married within the month. I have already given him my word. Cassandra set down her teacup very carefully, the china not quite steady in her hand. You did not ask me. I did not need to. I am refusing, she said, and the words came out steadier than she felt saying them. 6 years of careful silence cracking open at last. I will not marry Baron Colville. Uncle, I would rather take a position as a governess in the farthest corner of Scotland than spend one evening in that man's company, let alone a lifetime. The silence that followed was the particular, dangerous kind she had learned to recognize since childhood, the held breath before a storm. Reginald set down his own cup with exaggerated care. You will not embarrass this family by playing at independence you have no right to, he said, his voice dropping low. You have no fortune, no connections, no prospects beyond what I choose to arrange for you. You exist in this house on my charity, Cassandra, and you will remember that I have kept your accounts for 6 years without a single farthing of wages. Cassandra said, I do not think charity is the correct word for what I have given this house in return. She did not see the blow coming until it had already landed. It was not the announcement that ended the argument at breakfast. It came 3 nights later, at her own betrothal ball, held in the Fenwick townhouse before 100 guests who had been invited specifically to witness the arrangement made public, whether the bride wished it announced or not. The ballroom glittered with borrowed grandeur flowers hired for the evening. Candles doubled for the occasion. A small orchestra tucked into the corner, playing music no one was truly listening to. Cassandra stood beside her uncle near the receiving line. Her gown the pale rose silk he had purchased specifically to make her presentable for Baron Colville's inspection, and felt the entire evening pressing down on her like a held breath she could not release. Baron Colville arrived at 9:30, portly and perspiring despite the cool evening, and made directly for her with the proprietary confidence of a man collecting property he had already paid for. "My dear Miss Fenwick." He took her hand without asking, his grip damp through her glove. "You look positively radiant. I have told my housekeeper to prepare the blue chambers for you. I do hope you like blue. I have not yet accepted your proposal, my lord," Cassandra said, drawing her hand back as soon as she reasonably could. Colville's smile did not falter, though something colder moved behind his eyes. A formality. "Surely. Your uncle assures me the matter is settled." "My uncle does not speak for my heart, my lord, whatever he may speak for regarding my hand." It was not loud. It was not even particularly bold. Spoken as it was in the careful, controlled register she had used her entire life to soften every disagreement she had ever dared voice. But Lord Colville heard it, and several guests standing near enough heard it, and word of it reached Reginald Fenwick before the orchestra had finished its next measure. He crossed the ballroom floor with a fixed, brittle smile plastered across his face for the benefit of the watching room, and seized Cassandra's arm hard enough to bruise, drawing her several steps away from the Baron toward the relative privacy of a marble column. "What did you say to him?" he hissed. "The truth. You will apologize. You will accept his proposal tonight, in front of every guest in this room, and you will smile while you do it." "No," Cassandra said, and this time the word did not waver at all. 6 years of silence had built to precisely this moment, and she found, to her own surprise, that she was no longer afraid of what came next. "I will not marry him. I would rather starve." Reginald Fenwick's face went a mottled, furious red. His hand rose before either of them fully registered what was happening, and the crack of his palm across her cheek rang out clear and sharp enough to cut straight through the music, loud enough that the orchestra actually faltered mid-phrase, loud enough that the entire ballroom turned as one toward the sound. Cassandra staggered back against the marble column, one hand flying to her burning cheek. Her eyes stinging with tears, she refused, absolutely refused, to let fall in front of 100 witnesses. The silence that followed was absolute. "Ungrateful," Reginald spat, loud enough now that he no longer cared who heard him. His rage having entirely outpaced his discretion. 6 years I have fed you, clothed you, and this is how you repay me. Humiliating me in front of... That is enough." The voice cut across the ballroom floor like a blade through silk, and every head turned toward the doorway, where Julian Voss, Duke of Ravenscar, stood with an expression that made the nearest guests take an involuntary step back. He had arrived only minutes earlier, invited as a courtesy to Reginald's business dealings rather than any genuine friendship, and he had seen, with perfect clarity, the entire exchange unfold from across the room. He crossed the floor without hurrying, which somehow made it worse for Reginald Fenwick than if he had run. And he did not stop until he stood directly between them, his back to Cassandra, his grey eyes fixed on her uncle with an intensity that made the older man take a full step back. "You struck her," Julian said. "It was not a question. This is a family matter. Your Grace, I assure you it does not concern. She will marry me." 4 words. Flat. Immediate. Entirely without ceremony. Delivered in a voice that carried to every corner of the suddenly absolutely silent ballroom. Reginald's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound at all. Somewhere near the refreshment table, a glass was set down with a small, audible click, the only sound in the entire room. "Your Grace, I don't believe you understand the arrangement already made with Baron." "I understand perfectly." Julian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I understand that you have just struck a woman in front of 100 witnesses for declining a marriage she never consented to in the first place. I understand that I would rather marry her myself than watch you sell her to a man twice her age who was fool enough to think you had the right to make that bargain without her." He turned, finally, to look at Cassandra, and something in his expression gentled entirely. The fury banked but not extinguished. "If you will have me, Miss Fenwick, I make no claim on any dowry, any settlement, anything beyond your answer." Cassandra stood with her hand still pressed to her burning cheek, staring at a man she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with across the whole of the season, and found that the answer came to her with a clarity she had not expected to feel about anything ever again. "Yes," she said. Julian did not linger in the ballroom a moment longer than necessary. He arranged, within the quarter hour, for Cassandra to remove that very night to the townhouse of his own aunt, Lady Marchmont, rather than return under Reginald Fenwick's roof for even a single additional evening. And he saw her into the carriage himself, wrapping his own greatcoat around her shoulders against the night air, with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the cold fury he had shown her uncle only minutes before. "You need not go anywhere near that house again," he told her, standing at the carriage door. "Lady Marchmont will see you settled tonight. I will call tomorrow to discuss the arrangements properly, when you have had time to breathe. You did not ask me whether I wished to be rescued quite so thoroughly," Cassandra said, though there was no real objection in it, only a kind of dazed wonder at the sudden, complete reordering of her circumstances. "No," Julian agreed. "I did not. I find I am rather out of practice, asking permission when I have already decided a thing is right. I hope, in time, you will find it in you to forgive the presumption." Lady Marchmont, a sharp-eyed widow who had clearly been given the barest outline of events by her nephew's hurried note, received Cassandra with brisk, no-nonsense kindness, installing her in a guest chamber with hot water and a cold compress for her cheek before asking a single question about the circumstances that had brought her there. "My nephew does not act rashly," Lady Marchmont said finally. Once Cassandra had been settled by the fire, "Whatever passed between you and your uncle tonight, know that Julian does not offer his name lightly, and he has never once, in the 30 years I have known him, offered it out of pity. Then why did he offer it tonight? You will have to ask him that yourself." "My dear," Lady Marchmont said, with the faint, knowing smile of a woman who suspected the answer already, but had no intention of stealing her nephew's chance to give it. "Though I suspect the answer will surprise you rather less than you expect. The scandal, when it broke across London the following morning, was of a rather different flavour than the one Reginald Fenwick had spent the evening trying to prevent. It was not whispered behind fans in polite disapproval. It travelled with something closer to admiration, the Duke of Ravenscar, silencing a room with 4 words, claiming a bruised, humiliated young woman as his own in front of witnesses who would talk of nothing else for a fortnight. Lady Pembroke, 70 years old and famously difficult to impress, told her entire card party that she had not seen a man behave with such immediate, unhesitating decency at a ball in 30 years, and that Reginald Fenwick's reputation would not recover from being seen to strike his own niece, regardless of how the marriage settlement eventually resolved itself. Baron Colville, for his part, withdrew his suit within the week, unwilling to be associated with a family whose patriarch had just made himself the villain of every drawing-room conversation in Mayfair. Reginald Fenwick was left with nothing but his fury and a niece who was, as of the following Thursday, no longer his to command. Baron Colville called at the Fenwick townhouse 2 days after the ball, ostensibly to discuss the terms of a settlement that no longer existed, though in truth to salvage what remained of his own dignity before the gossip could finish its work without his input. I trust you understand this changes nothing regarding my own reputation, Colville said stiffly, refusing to sit in the parlour Reginald had once used to negotiate his niece's future without her knowledge. I will simply tell people I withdrew my own suit upon learning of certain irregularities in the young lady's temperament. You may tell people whatever preserves your comfort, my lord, Reginald snapped, though the fight had largely gone out of him by then. It does not change the fact that a duke has made off with the only asset either of us thought worth having. An asset. Colville's mouth twisted with distaste he did not trouble to hide. You struck her in front of 100 witnesses. Fenwick. I do not care to be associated with the sort of man who requires his hand to secure his niece's cooperation. I had thought better of the arrangement before I saw the truth of the household I was marrying into. He left within the quarter hour and did not call again. Word of the exchange reached the wider circles of London society within days, softened and sharpened in equal measure with each retelling, until the prevailing account settled into something remarkably close to the truth, that Reginald Fenwick had struck his own niece to force a marriage she did not want, and that a duke, of all people, had been the only man in the room willing to do something about it. Thus, Julian called on Lady Marchmont's townhouse each afternoon during the 11 days before the wedding, always properly chaperoned, always careful of Cassandra's still raw composure. And it was during a walk through the small back garden on the 4th day that she found herself asking the question that had been sitting uneasily in her chest since the ballroom. "Why me?" she said, watching a robin pick its way along the garden wall rather than looking at him directly. You could have simply reprimanded my uncle and left the rest to society's judgment. You did not need to marry me to prove a point about his cruelty. I did not marry you to prove a point, Julian said. I am aware it must appear that way, given the circumstances. But I have spent a great many seasons watching young women paraded through ballrooms like livestock at market, and I confess I had begun to believe I would never meet one who seemed to notice the indignity of it as clearly as I did. And then I watched you refuse a marriage that would have secured your comfort at the cost of your entire self, and take a blow for the privilege of having said so plainly. He stopped walking, and she stopped beside him, finally meeting his eyes. I did not act to prove a point, Cassandra. I acted because I could not stand in that room a moment longer, and watch a woman with that much courage be told she was worth nothing at all. "You do not know me," she said, though gently now, without the wariness that had coloured the question days earlier. "Whatever courage you saw in one moment at a ball." "No," he agreed, "but I find I would very much like to. I do not require you to love me. Cassandra, not yet. Perhaps not for some time. I require only that you allow me the chance to earn whatever regard you eventually decide I deserve, on the strength of my own conduct, rather than the drama of one evening." She considered this for a long moment, the robin finally taking flight from the garden wall in a small flurry of wings. "That," she said slowly, "is the first proposal of marriage I have ever received that did not begin by informing me what I was worth to someone else. I should hope it will be the last proposal you ever receive at all," Julian said. And there was, for the first time since the ballroom, something almost like humour in it. Dry and understated, that made her laugh despite everything the week had cost her. That evening, Lady Marchmont found Cassandra still awake long past the household's usual hour, sitting by her bedroom window with the marriage settlement papers unread in her lap. "You are allowed to be frightened, you know," Lady Marchmont said, settling into the chair opposite without being asked, in the manner of a woman long accustomed to installing herself wherever she judged she was needed. A great many young women would be, marrying a man they have known scarcely a fortnight, however gallant the circumstances of the acquaintance. "I am not frightened of Julian," Cassandra said. "I find I am frightened of how easily I have come to trust him. After 22 years of learning that trust was generally a mistake." "Ah!" Lady Marchmont's expression softened into something knowing. "That is a rather different fear, and a considerably more sensible one. I will tell you what I told my own daughter, on a night rather like this one, many years ago. Trust is not a single leap, taken once and never revisited. It is a habit, built one honest choice at a time, and my nephew has never, in the whole of his life, given me reason to doubt his honesty, even when it cost him considerably more comfortable alternatives. Watch what he does in the small, unremarked moments. Cassandra, not merely the dramatic ones. That is where a man's true character reveals itself. Long after the ballroom has forgotten his name, Cassandra thought of this advice often in the months that followed, and found, each time she tested it against some small, unremarked kindness, a gown chosen in exactly the shade she preferred without being told, a household ledger handed over without a single condition attached, a fortnight of patient stillness while his own ankle mended, rather than a single complaint about the inconvenience that Lady Marchmont's counsel had been, as it so often was, entirely correct. The wedding took place quietly, 11 days later, in a small chapel far removed from the gossip that still churned through London's better addresses. Cassandra wore green, not because it was fashionable, but because Julian had noticed, at some point during their brief, formal courtship, that it was the only colour she ever seemed to choose for herself when no one else was dictating her wardrobe, and he had quietly ensured the gown was made in exactly that shade without telling her why until she asked. "How did you know?" she asked him, in the carriage afterward, the church bells still ringing faintly behind them. "I pay attention," Julian said simply. "It is, I find, a rather underused skill among men of my acquaintance." Oh, Ravenscar Hall received its new duchess with considerably more suspicion than warmth. Mrs. Abbott, the housekeeper, had run the household for 11 years under a bachelor duke who had never once questioned her judgment on any matter. And she met Cassandra on the front steps, with the stiff, correct curtsy of a woman who had already privately decided that a bride acquired under scandalous circumstances at a public ball was unlikely to last the winter. "Your Grace." "Mrs." Abbott's eyes moved over Cassandra's travelling clothes, plain, practical, chosen for a long carriage journey rather than for making an impression. "I've had the blue chamber prepared, as His Grace instructed." "Thank you." "Mrs. Abbott, I should like to see the household accounts at your earliest convenience, if that would not trouble you." "Mrs." Abbott's eyebrows rose a fraction. "The accounts." "Your Grace, I have kept a household's books for 6 years. I find idleness does not suit me, and I would rather understand how Ravenscar Hall runs than sit uselessly in a drawing-room waiting for someone to explain it to me eventually." It took less than a fortnight for Mrs. Abbott's skepticism to begin, grudgingly, to erode. Cassandra found a linen inventory that had not been properly reconciled in 3 years. A coal merchant who had been quietly overcharging the estate by a margin large enough to matter, and a tenant dispute over a boundary hedge that the previous steward had simply ignored rather than resolve. She did not announce any of these discoveries with fanfare. She simply corrected them, methodically, the way she corrected everything. And within a month Mrs. Abbott found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, seeking the new Duchess's opinion before making any decision of consequence at all. "I did not think a duke's bride would trouble herself with coal merchants and linen counts as..." Mrs. Abbott admitted one evening, watching Cassandra work through the monthly accounts at the study desk with brisk, practiced efficiency. "I did not think a duke's bride would be permitted to," Cassandra replied, without looking up. "I find His Grace has rather different notions on the subject than most husbands of his rank." "That he does," Mrs. Abbott said, and there was, for the first time, something like genuine approval in her voice. "That he does, Your Grace." Mrs. Abbott's approval was tested properly only once. In the first hard weeks of winter, when a fever swept through the tenant cottages along the lower valley, and the estate's usual physician was called away to a difficult berth some 20 miles distant, Cassandra did not wait for permission or for a substitute physician to be found. She organized the household stores of linen and broth herself, rode out to the affected cottages with Mrs. Abbott at her side, despite the housekeeper's initial protests about propriety, and spent 3 days moving between sick rooms with the same brisk, unflinching competence she brought to a column of figures. The worst of it settled in the cottage of a widowed tenant named Agnes Combe, whose youngest boy had taken the fever badly enough that the local midwife had quietly begun preparing the mother for the possibility of loss. Cassandra sat with the child through the second night herself, changing cool cloths and coaxing thin broth past cracked lips long after Mrs. Abbott had gently suggested she return to the hall and rest. "He is not your child, Your Grace," Agnes said at one point, exhausted past the point of proper deference. "You needn't sit up with him same as I would." "I sat up with no one. Once, when I might have wished someone would," Cassandra said, not looking up from the boy's flushed face. "I find I would rather be the person I once needed than continue wishing one had existed." The boy's fever broke before dawn, and by the time the valley's illness had run its full course a week later, every affected tenant had recovered. Mrs. Abbott had stopped referring to Cassandra as merely Her Grace in her private conversations with the other staff, and had begun, without any particular announcement, to speak of her instead as the Duchess in a tone that carried something considerably closer to reverence. It was not until they had been married nearly a month, settled into the quiet rhythms of Ravenscar Hall, that Cassandra began to wonder exactly how much attention he had been paying, and for how long. "You knew my uncle before that night," she said one evening, watching him across the study where they had taken to sharing the long hours after dinner, she with the estate ledgers, he with his correspondence. "You did not simply happen to attend that ball as a courtesy." Julian did not look up immediately from his letter. "I have done business with your uncle. Land, mostly. Water rights along the eastern boundary of his property." "That is not an answer." He set down his pen then, and looked at her for a long moment, something careful and considering in his expression. "I had heard things," he said finally, "from tenants who worked land bordering his estate, about a niece who kept the household running with no wages and no gratitude in return. I did not know your face until that ball. I confess I had wondered, before I ever saw you, what kind of man treats a member of his own household as an unpaid clerk for 6 years. And when you saw me struck, I stopped wondering and started acting." He said it plainly, the way he seemed to say everything, without embellishment. "I will not pretend the decision was entirely spontaneous. Cassandra, I had thought of you before that night, in the abstract, as an injustice I had heard about second-hand. I had simply never expected to witness the injustice directly, or to find myself so entirely unwilling to let it continue once I had." "You make it sound almost accidental," Cassandra said, "as though I were simply the nearest injustice available on a convenient evening." "No." Julian's voice sharpened, not unkindly, but with a firmness that made her look up from her own hands. "I have attended a great many balls in my life, Cassandra, and witnessed a great many small cruelties I chose not to involve myself in, because it was easier, because it was not my place, because intervening in another man's household felt presumptuous even when every instinct told me it was warranted. I had made peace, or thought I had, with being a man who noticed such things and did nothing. That night, I found I could no longer make that peace. I do not know precisely why that particular evening broke something in me that 100 similar evenings had not. I have thought about it a great deal since, and the only honest answer I have found is that it was you specifically, not merely the situation, that made inaction impossible." Cassandra considered this for a long moment, turning it over, the way she turned over a column of figures that did not quite balance. "You could have said something sooner, intervened sooner." "I could have," Julian agreed, and for the first time she heard something like genuine regret in his voice. "I told myself it was not my place. I have learned, since that night, that telling oneself something is not one's place is very often simply cowardice wearing a more respectable coat." He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "I do not intend to make that mistake again, in any matter that concerns you." "What?" The storm came down off the hills without warning. 3 weeks later, while Julian was out riding the eastern boundary with his steward, and Cassandra remained at the hall reviewing the quarter's accounts. What began as ordinary autumn rain turned within the hour into something considerably more violent, wind tearing at the old oaks along the drive, and when full dark fell with no sign of the riding party's return, Cassandra found herself standing at the study window, watching the storm with a knot of fear tightening steadily in her chest. "Mrs. Abbott," she said, when the housekeeper appeared to draw the curtains. "Has His Grace ever been this late returning in weather such as this?" "Not in my memory, Your Grace." Mrs. Abbott's expression, carefully neutral, did little to disguise her own concern. Though the eastern boundary is rough ground, it would not be the first time a horse came up lame far from home. Cassandra did not wait for further reassurance. She ordered a lantern and a stout cloak, and against Mrs. Abbott's vigorous protests, rode out herself along the eastern track with 2 grooms, following the boundary fence through driving rain until they found the steward's horse first, wandering riderless and spooked near a collapsed section of dry stone wall, and then, some quarter-mile further, Julian himself, soaked through and limping badly, having been thrown when his own mount had shied at the exact moment the wall gave way beneath the weight of a rain-loosened embankment. "You should not have come out in this," he said through gritted teeth, as she knelt beside him in the mud, assessing the awkward angle of his ankle with the same brisk efficiency she brought to a column of figures. "You should not have ridden the eastern boundary in a gathering storm," Cassandra said. "And yet here we both are, making poor decisions in service of stubbornness. Can you stand? If I help you?" He could, barely. And between Cassandra and the 2 grooms, they managed to get him mounted behind one of the horses for the slow, miserable journey back to the hall, rain lashing at them the entire way. It was well past midnight before the doctor had finished setting the ankle and departed, and Cassandra sat beside the bed afterward, wringing out a cloth to press against Julian's rain-chilled forehead, refusing every suggestion that she retire to her own chamber and let the household staff manage the rest of the night. "You did not need to ride out yourself," Julian said quietly, watching her in the low candlelight. "You might have sent the grooms and waited safely indoors." "I have spent a great many years waiting safely indoors while other people decided things for me," Cassandra said. "I find I have very little appetite left for it, even when the weather advises otherwise." Something in his expression, exhausted and pain-fogged as it was, softened into something that looked remarkably like wonder. "I do not think," he said slowly, "that my father's wife ever once considered riding out into a storm for his sake. I do not think it occurred to her that she was permitted to. Then I am glad to be considerably less permitted, and considerably more willing," Cassandra said, and pressed a kiss to his temple that had nothing of formality left in it at all. He was confined to a chair by the fire for the better part of a fortnight while the ankle mended, and Cassandra found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she rather enjoyed the enforced stillness it imposed on a man otherwise constantly in motion between tenant farms and estate business. She brought the household ledgers to his study each morning rather than working alone, and they fell into the habit of reviewing the accounts together, Julian offering opinions on matters of land management she had never had reason to learn, Cassandra correcting his arithmetic with a bluntness that made him laugh more in that single fortnight than she suspected he had laughed in the whole of the preceding year. "You are entirely insufferable when you are right," he told her, on the 3rd morning, after she had identified an error in his own tenant rent calculations that had apparently gone unnoticed for 2 full quarters. "I am insufferable, regardless of whether I am right. Your Grace, being correct simply gives me less reason to moderate it." The Dowager Duchess arrived unannounced during the 2nd week of Julian's confinement, having heard second-hand of her son's riding accident from a cousin rather than from Julian himself, and swept into the study with the brisk, faintly wounded energy of a mother who suspected, correctly, that she had not been informed promptly enough for her own liking. "You might have sent word yourself," she said to Julian, by way of greeting, before turning her sharp attention fully on to Cassandra. And you, the famous Duchess of the ballroom, slap. I have heard 3 different accounts of that evening, each more dramatic than the last, and I have come to hear the truth from someone who was actually present. I was struck by my uncle, your Grace, in front of a great many witnesses, and your son objected to it rather more forcefully than anyone else in the room, Cassandra said. I am not certain there is a more dramatic version available than the truth. The dowager studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression eased. Some private calculation apparently resolving in Cassandra's favor. No, she agreed. I don't suppose there is. She settled into the chair nearest the fire without waiting to be invited. I will tell you something my son has likely never told you plainly, though I suspect you have already guessed the shape of it. His father was not a kind man in this house. Duchess, I spent 30 years learning precisely how much space I was permitted to occupy in my own marriage, and it was considerably less than I deserved. I watched my son learn the same lesson far too young, and I watched him spend the years since, determined never to become the man who taught it to him. Mother, Julian said, a note of warning in his voice, though there was no real heat in it. Let me finish. Julian, I am old, and I have earned the right to embarrass you at least once a fortnight. The dowager's gaze returned to Cassandra. Softer now. I did not understand, until word reached me of that ballroom, quite how thoroughly he had succeeded in becoming a different sort of man than his father. I understand it rather better now, having heard how quickly he crossed that floor for a woman he had barely spoken to. Whatever you did to inspire that, Duchess, I find I am considerably more grateful for it than I know how to properly express. She stayed only 2 days, inspecting the household accounts with the same thoroughness Cassandra had come to expect from anyone who had ever run an estate of consequence, and finding, to her evident and vocal satisfaction, nothing whatsoever to criticize. On the morning of her departure, she took Cassandra's hands in her own. Briefly, the same unpracticed warmth she had shown once before. My son spent a great many years believing that gentleness and weakness were the same failing, because his father taught him so with his fists. The dowager said, I have watched him these 2 days, Duchess, and I haven't seen him look so entirely at peace with himself since he was a boy too young to know yet what his own house would cost him. Whatever you are doing, do not stop. Oh! It was some weeks later, on another night when neither of them could sleep, that Cassandra learned why Julian understood cruelty so immediately, and why his fury at her uncle had burned so hot and so fast. She found him in the library, a glass of brandy untouched on the table beside him, staring into the dying fire with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the calm, measured authority he wore for the world, but something raw, older, worn thinner by years rather than hours. I did not mean to disturb you, she said, moving to leave. Stay. He did not look up. If you can bear it. She stayed. She sat in the chair opposite, and waited, and after a long silence he began to speak, haltingly at first, of a father who had ruled Ravenscar Hall through fear rather than affection, who had believed that a son's obedience was owed rather than earned, who had used his hands the way Reginald Fenwick had used his voice as a tool for ensuring compliance rather than a means of connection. I was younger than you when I understood that love, in this house, had always been conditional, Julian said quietly, that any misstep, Any word spoken out of turn would be answered with something considerably worse than disapproval. I promised myself, watching my mother endure the same, that I would never become a man who ruled through fear. I did not fully understand how deep that promise ran until I watched your uncle raise his hand to you, and felt every old wound in me answer at once. Cassandra crossed the small space between them and knelt beside his chair, taking his hand in both of hers, the same gesture he had offered her weeks earlier. "I am sorry," she said, "that you carried that alone for so long." "I am not entirely alone now," Julian said, and something in his voice cracked open, warm and unguarded, as he turned his hand to lace his fingers through hers. "I find I have not been, since the moment I crossed that ballroom floor." He kissed her, then, slowly, deliberately, the careful reserve he had maintained through their brief courtship finally giving way to something neither of them had any further interest in restraining. And when they climbed the stairs together that night, it was with the unhurried certainty of two people who had each, in their own way, spent a lifetime waiting to be chosen for exactly who they were, rather than what they could provide. Reginald Fenwick did not accept his defeat quietly. 3 months after the wedding, his solicitors filed a formal petition disputing the terms under which Cassandra had left his household, claiming that as her legal guardian until her 25th birthday, he retained control over a small inheritance left to her by her late mother funds that Cassandra had never seen a farthing of, and had, until the petition arrived, not known existed at all. "He never mentioned an inheritance," Cassandra said, reading the solicitor's letter with a slow, cold understanding building in her chest. "In 6 years of keeping his accounts, I never once saw an entry for funds held in trust for me, because he did not want you to look for them," Julian said grimly, "which suggests, rather strongly, that they are no longer where they ought to be." Reginald did not limit his efforts to the courts. Within days of filing the petition, whispers began circulating through the drawing rooms Cassandra had only recently begun to feel welcome in, suggesting that the new Duchess of Ravenscar had married in unseemly haste to escape debts of her own, that her uncle's petition was motivated by genuine concern for a niece who had fallen under the sway of a man more interested in her mother's fortune than her hand. It was, Cassandra recognized immediately, a clumsy echo of the very tactic Baron Colville had once threatened, and she found she had considerably less patience for it now than she might have shown a year earlier. "He is testing whether we will pay him to make the petition disappear quietly," Julian said, reading the same letter that had reached Cassandra from a cousin eager to relay the gossip. "It is what men like your uncle do when they have no genuine claim. They manufacture enough noise to make silence seem the cheaper option." "Then we will not give him silence," Cassandra said. She spent the following week in the Ravenscar Hall study from dawn until well past dark, reconstructing 6 years of household accounts from memory, cross-referencing dates against her own recollection of when certain entries had appeared, when her uncle's household had suddenly acquired new carriage horses or settled debts that should have exceeded his ordinary income. By the end of the week, she had built a ledger of her own, precise enough to withstand any scrutiny a court might apply to it, each entry annotated in the same careful hand she had used for 6 years to balance a household that had never once thanked her for the effort. "You have built an entire case from memory," Julian said, looking over the finished ledger with something between admiration and disbelief. "I have built an entire case from 6 years of paying very close attention to a man who never once suspected I was paying attention to anything beyond what he told me to see. Cassandra said, "It is, I find, the only advantage silence ever gave me. I intend to spend it well." The confrontation, when it came, did not take place in a ballroom. It took place in the offices of Reginald's own solicitor, at a meeting called ostensibly to negotiate the terms of the inheritance dispute, attended by both men's legal counsel and, at Cassandra's own insistence, by Cassandra herself. "This is not a matter requiring the Duchess's presence," Reginald said stiffly, refusing to look directly at her. "It is entirely a matter requiring my presence, Uncle, as it concerns my own inheritance." Cassandra opened the small leather case she had brought with her, and withdrew a slim ledger of her own, one she had quietly reconstructed over the preceding weeks from memory and from careful cross-referencing of the household accounts she had kept for 6 years. "You will recall that when you set me to managing your household books at 16, the very first task you gave me was organizing 5 years of unreconciled correspondence and bank papers left over from before Aunt Judith's death, papers no one else in this house had troubled to make sense of since my mother died. I read every page of that archive myself, Uncle, long before you ever trusted me with a fresh ledger of my own. I have, since then, found several entries recorded simply as estate maintenance and incidental expenses, totaling considerably more than any household of our size could reasonably require, dated from precisely the period following my mother's death." Reginald's solicitor shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Fenwick, that is to say, Your Grace, these are merely routine. I would be very interested to see the original bank records for the trust my mother established," Cassandra continued, her voice level and entirely without heat. "I suspect they will show that my uncle has been drawing against my inheritance ever since my mother's death, disguised within his own household ledgers, precisely because he knew I would one day be the one person in that house capable of noticing the discrepancy, and precisely because he ensured I never had reason to look at that particular column of figures until it was far too late to stop him quietly." The silence in the room was absolute. Reginald's face had gone the same mottled red she remembered from the ballroom, though this time there was no daughter, no Nisa, no dependent left to strike in place of an answer he could not give. "You cannot prove. I kept every ledger I ever balanced for you, Uncle, in my own private notation, precisely because I learned very early in that house that written proof was the only currency that mattered to you." Cassandra placed her own ledger on the desk between them. Reginald's solicitor cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly recalculating the wisdom of proceeding further. "Your Grace, perhaps a private conference between the families might resolve." "There is nothing private left to resolve, sir," Julian said, speaking for the first time since the meeting had begun, his voice carrying the same flat, immovable authority that had once silenced an entire ballroom. "Lord Fenwick struck a member of his own household hard enough to leave a mark visible to 100 witnesses. He has spent over a decade drawing against funds held in trust for a niece he provided no wages to in exchange for 6 years of her labor. I would think very carefully before this proceeds a single step further. About which version of these facts you would prefer a chancery judge to hear first?" Reginald's mouth worked silently for a moment, some last, futile calculation playing out behind his eyes before collapsing entirely. "What?" he said finally, his voice considerably smaller than it had been at the start of the meeting. "Would you consider sufficient to end this matter quietly? The full trust, restored immediately, with interest calculated from the date of my mother's death. Cassandra said, "And a written acknowledgment, held by your own solicitor, confirming the terms so that this cannot be revisited a second time when your finances next require it. That is extortion. That is considerably more generous than what a formal accounting before the court would cost you, Uncle, and we both know it." Cassandra closed her own ledger with a small, final click. "You have until Friday to decide which version of this conversation you would prefer to have been true." Reginald Fenwick settled the trust in full within the week, along with a considerable additional sum his solicitor privately described as compensation for avoided embarrassment. And the matter never did reach the courts. Julian, watching the entire negotiation from beside her without once needing to intervene, found himself unable to keep the fierce, quiet pride from his expression as they left the solicitor's office together. "You did not need me at all," he said, as they climbed into the carriage. "No," Cassandra agreed, settling against his shoulder with a small, tired smile. "But I find I am glad you were there regardless." Society, having already decided months earlier that Reginald Fenwick was the villain of the piece, received the news of the settled inheritance with open satisfaction. Cassandra and Julian attended the Ashworth ball 3 weeks later, their first significant appearance in London since the wedding, and Cassandra found herself, for the first time in her life, entering a crowded room without the familiar tightening of dread in her chest. Lady Pembroke intercepted her within minutes of their arrival, gripping both her hands with unexpected warmth. "My dear Duchess, I understand your uncle's little difficulty has resolved itself rather thoroughly in your favour. Thoroughly enough." "Lady Pembroke." "Good." The old woman's eyes glinted with satisfaction. "I have not enjoyed a scandal, this well-deserved in a great many years. Come, you must tell me everything, and you must dance at least once before I release you, since I understand you have not properly danced in this house since your come-out." Across the room, Cassandra caught sight of Reginald's absence, conspicuously noted by several groups of whispering guests, and felt, for the first time, no particular satisfaction in his humiliation at all, only a quiet, settled relief that his opinion of her had finally, entirely, ceased to matter. Baron Colville, however, had not entirely absented himself from London society, and he intercepted her near the refreshment table while Julian was briefly occupied elsewhere, his smile carrying the same oily confidence she remembered from her betrothal ball. "Your Grace," he bowed with exaggerated slowness, "how fortune has favoured you since our last acquaintance." I confess I wondered, at the time, whether the Duke's gallantry would survive contact with ordinary domestic life. I am pleased to see the marriage has, at least outwardly, proven durable. You are very kind to concern yourself with my domestic arrangements, my lord, given how little claim you retained on them. No claim at all, I assure you, merely curiosity. Colville's eyes glinted. Some old, petty grievance still simmering beneath the pleasantry. I understand your uncle has fared rather less fortunately than yourself. It seems a pity, doesn't it, when family turns so entirely against family. It seems a pity that a man struck his niece in front of 100 witnesses to force a marriage she did not want, Cassandra said, her voice carrying just enough for the nearest listeners to catch it clearly. I find I reserve my pity for considerably more deserving recipients than either my uncle or the gentleman who once found his arrangement agreeable. Colville's smile faltered, colour rising in his fleshy face as several guests within earshot turned with open interest. He opened his mouth to reply, found nothing adequate to say, and retreated toward the card room with what dignity he could salvage, leaving Cassandra alone at the refreshment table with the distinct, satisfying sense that she had finally closed a door that had been left carelessly ajar for the better part of a year. "I saw that," Julian said, appearing at her side moments later, something like fierce pride warming his expression. "I take it Colville required reminding of his own history in this matter." "He required a great deal of reminding," Cassandra said. "I found I rather enjoyed providing it. You look remarkably at ease for a woman surrounded by the very people who once decided your worth for you," Julian murmured, finding her at the edge of the floor some time later. "I have discovered that a room feels considerably smaller once you stop being afraid of what it might say about you," Cassandra said, and took his offered hand for the dance Lady Pembroke had insisted upon, moving through the same steps she had once performed at her own betrothal, ball with her whole future decided by someone else, feeling now, finally, as though every choice in the room belonged entirely to her. 3 years passed, and Ravenscar Hall filled slowly with a warmth it had not held in a generation. The tenant farms flourished under Cassandra's careful management. The household ledgers balanced themselves under her steady hand with a precision the old steward had never managed to achieve, and the halls that had once echoed with a father's temper now more often echoed with the sound of a small daughter's laughter, chasing an even smaller spaniel down the long gallery, while her parents watched from the doorway with matching, helpless affection. News of Reginald Fenwick reached them only rarely by then, carried second-hand through cousins who still moved in the circles he had once dominated. He had never fully recovered the standing he lost the night he struck his niece at her own betrothal ball. The settlement he had been forced to pay from her mother's trust had left his own finances considerably diminished, and the last word Cassandra received of him placed him in a modest set of rooms in Bath, living, by all accounts, a quiet and largely friendless retirement among people who had no notion of the man he had once been in London, drawing rooms. Cassandra found, turning the news over once and setting it aside, that she felt nothing sharper than a distant, settled indifference, the particular piece of a wound that had finally, thoroughly healed, leaving behind no scar tissue, eager to reopen at the mention of his name. "Margaret will be the ruin of that carpet," Julian observed, watching their daughter tumble happily onto the rug in pursuit of the dog. "Margaret will be the ruin of considerably more than the carpet, if she takes after her mother," Cassandra said, though there was no complaint in it at all, only warmth. "I am counting on it," Julian said, and meant it entirely, drawing his wife against his side as they watched their daughter's laughter fill a house that had once known only silence and fear. Margaret was joined, some 18 months later, by a brother, William, a solemn, watchful infant who grew into a boy with his father's steady grey eyes and his mother's habit of noticing everything long before he chose to comment on it. Cassandra taught both children their letters at the same study desk, where she had once reconstructed 6 years of stolen accounts from memory, and she made certain, from the earliest age either of them could understand it, that no voice in that house would ever again be silenced simply for the comfort of someone larger and louder. Margaret, at 7, had already inherited her mother's flat, unshakable manner of stating an inconvenient truth directly to the person least eager to hear it, a trait Julian found endlessly, helplessly amusing, and Mrs. Abbott found endlessly, helplessly familiar. Cassandra Fenwick had spent 6 years learning that silence was the price of safety in her uncle's house. She had spent the years since learning, slowly and then all at once, that safety built on silence was never truly safety at all, and that the 4 words spoken by a stranger across a ballroom floor had given her, at last, the one thing 6 years of obedience never had, the certainty that her voice, once raised, would never again go unanswered. If you have ever been told that your silence was the price of belonging somewhere, I hope you remember this story. You do not owe anyone your voice in exchange for a roof over your head. Sometimes the person who finally hears you is someone you never expected, standing closer than you knew, waiting only for the moment you found the courage to speak. If Cassandra and Julian's story moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories. Share this video with someone who has ever had to find their own courage in a room that wanted them silent. And if you enjoyed this emotional historical romance, please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, what would you have said, standing in Cassandra's place? Before the Duke ever crossed that room, I read every comment, and I will see you in the next story.